any wargame, anytime.
All right, everyone, it is time for another episode of the Any War Game Anytime podcast, and we have a super special guest. Super excited to have him on. Love his work, but before that, Sam, how you doing, man?
Doing okay. Still dealing with my bad back. Been
Oh, jeez.
been having trouble moving around these days, but that's life, you know.
Yeah, yeah, I feel you. Get a little older, it's like you can't. It's like there was a time in your life you didn't have constant pains. Can you believe it?
No.
No, yeah, that's a myth.
Boss, how you doing, man?
I'm doing pretty well. I'm a week into my one-page rules campaign that I'm running at my local games club, and yeah, it started off really well. We're following the guidelines in the rulebook, so you're kind of escalating points, and yeah, the first round went good. I've got six different factions playing, so we all get a good chance to really kind of face off against different factions, and I'm working on building up the lore. And yeah, I'm just really diving into it and having fun.
Well, speaking of lore, we'll get into that. But I love one page rules and I'm gonna play it, but I have to say I have been on an epic 40K kick. And actually I've just finished a game of epic 40K and oh my goodness, I'm gonna try to do a battle report on it. I've been man, it's just such a great game. And I'm looking forward to I know that OPR is producing some 6 millimeter scale. I think like I said, we've talked about it before. I love that scale. And I love that OPR is pushing that scale. I'm just super excited about it. But speaking of lore, we've got I was really great. It was really awesome to actually get him on. I didn't think we would. It is Mr. One Page More himself. How you doing, Mr.
Hello.
One Page More?
I'm doing good. I'm glad to be on here. You're acting like I'm some big fancy celebrity the way you're hyping me up for this podcast.
No, you are. You see everyone,
You
and
put
like
out pro level content. It's
yeah.
amazing.
Oh,
And
appreciate it.
you've got that voice, man. It's like that. Are you like? It's like that announcer voice as well, like super good. So,
Yes. I've practiced that since I was a little boy. I even used it to remember the old One Spice commercials with that guy. It's
uh-huh.
like uh I had it memorized at one point, the entire commercial. Ladies, or what is it? Oh, I cannot remember it, but it was something like these are tickets to the things that you wanted. And so I used to practice the voice to get good and actually got a couple of dates off of that. So and then
Wow.
decided to do a YouTube channel. So
Yeah, and we're gonna get into that a little bit. So yeah, real quick. So just tell us a little bit about your history in wargaming. Because this is something we have a few questions we always ask our guests, and one of which is like, how did you find out about sort of this this hobby?
yeah, so I have a peculiar story when it comes to getting into this hobby. Usually, from talking to friends and stuff, you get into it when you're young, or you're introduced to it, or you go into a game store and you see some cool models. I was in my 20s when I first got into wargaming. I served a mission for my church, and when I came back, I made a made a met a friend who had been wargaming in Warhammer Fantasy and 40K for years, and he brought me over to his house, showed me his collection, and I played a bunch of games with him. I won like two. Uh, either he's really good or I'm really bad at it. But I started out with the Chaos Warriors for Warhammer Fantasy before it
Mhm.
became Age of Sigmar, and then didn't really do much with the hobby for years after that. I tried to get into playing the Tyranids because I love swarmy aliens and hive minds. That's my jam. But I bought like five gargoyles off of eBay, and that was the most armory I had And then when I with the pandemic, I really got into the video game StarCraft 2, which is usually
Oh,
not where
yes.
you think of going when you think about wargaming, but I really got into it. I was late to that game. I never played StarCraft 1. And I played like a 2,000 ladder matches over the course of 3 years and fell in love with the Zerg, as
Mhm.
you would expect. And so I decided that I was going to make a custom Zerg army and as a proxy for Tyranids. And so I started making Zerg sculpts, learn how to learn 3D printing, buy a 3D printer, had to learn 3D sculpting, buy software for that. And then when I was working on it, I realized, you know, there aren't a really good, there isn't really a good way for me to play this army in most game stores if I want to play 40K. So I looked for an alternative game system, found one page rules. Like, oh, this is fantastic. The Valiant Hives, I can line it up with the Zerg real nice. And then I went on working on that project. And that's how I kind of got that. My first army was one that I built completely custom. And then also my first real foray into wargaming is one page rules.
Wow, that is so good to actually hear there are people who sort of didn't have to kind of well you wouldn't do fantasy, but you really didn't spend years sort of trudging through Games Workshop. It seems like you found one page rules relatively early on and just
Yes.
that's sort of and that's great. That is that's awesome. So
The
where
way
can yeah.
the way I like to describe it is I bounced off of 40K. That no
Yeah.
matter any attempt to get into it, I just bounced off of it. I tried getting it into a seventh edition and read the rules. I'm like, oh, this is a mess. And then eighth edition, I'm like, okay. And then ninth edition, and I'm like, okay, we're just one page rules all the way. Sorry.
Yeah.
And it's
No,
so
no,
it's
no.
it's so cool that your first army was one that you'd actually made yourself. Like that's super cool.
Mhm.
I do
Can
not
people
recommend it.
now can people find your
Yes.
sculpt? Okay.
Yes.
Where,
All of my sculpts are available on my Colts 3D page under Old One Eye or
mhm.
on Thingiverse, again, under Old One Eye. If you on either platform, if you search Zerg, I'm gonna be the probably the number one um, option when it pops up. And so all of my sculpts are available online for free.
Very good. We'll post links to those sculpts. That is so that's really cool. And and that's something I think that me, Sam, and Boz, part of this channel is I think all of us are sort of have suffered through Games Workshop for so many years. We're sort of grizzled, and it's really made all of us sort of cynical and a bit grizzled that I think especially one of my personal goals is to make OPR get bigger so that when new people come into they're not they have a better experience than just some of dealing with just GW and not becoming sort of these scars. I think that I'll speak for myself that I have maybe Boz and Sam. I don't know how, and if you guys
No, I
maybe we
think I think that's entirely accurate. There's
okay. I have scars.
yeah,
I know Sam has got scars because
Yeah, you got
we're
you just
fantasy.
you just gotta wonder, like if the entry point to wargaming, wasn't terrible,
Mm,
how many more people would do this?
yeah,
that's
Yeah.
right. That's
yeah.
right.
Yeah, I've heard it. I apologize.
That's okay. You go.
I've heard it described as a traumatic birth into wargaming, the entryway of through
Oh, that's
GW.
good. That's good. Yeah, I always describe myself as a GW refugee.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah, and unfortunately, now that's just and then there's the companies that aren't any better either, which is just sometimes it's a struggle.
Well, I think what makes and we could spend one all game where like we have to sometimes avoid what we used to call chasing rabbits, but like so I won't go further because then we'll be chasing rabbits. And really this isn't about, you know, like it's good because we can start talking about that, but honestly, one page more, you've got so much great content that um going to try to avoid that for now. Let's just say I'd love to get this conversation, but just for time's sake, we want to make sure
Sure.
that because you've really got a lot of stuff to talk about. But real quick, before we get into it, how did you just like decide to start a YouTube channel? Like, when did just this thing click in your mind that I wanted to start a
Yeah.
YouTube?
So, again, a little odd entryway into the wargaming world. I've actually never read a 40K book, Black Library book, period. The most I've read from them is the Tyranid Codex from 6th edition that my friend had. But I have consumed an unholy number of hours of lore content via YouTube and podcast. And so that's kind of where a lot of my time was spent, was listening to these cool stories and exploring these cool worlds. And I'm like, I would really like to make a podcast or a YouTube channel or something. This is years ago. Maybe getting into 40K because that seems like a cool thing. I tried and I learned how many Horus Heresy books there were, and then I went and took a nap
Yeah,
after.
that's rough.
And so I'm like, okay, I can't do that. Well, when One Page Rules announced that they were making lore, I got really excited because while I was working on my Zerg army, I spent hours and hours and hours working on those sculpts because I'm not good at sculpting. But I would be listening to lore about the Flood from Halo or the Zerg from StarCraft and StarCraft 2. There's not a whole lot of lore there, but I listened to it as much as I could. And then there's also not a ton of lore when it comes to Tyranids. I'm like, I would really like to listen to more lore about the army I'm building, specifically alien hives. Like that'd be great. And so, see a need, fill a need. So when they announced that they're making the lore and they released it, I'm like, perfect. I'm going to make a channel that covers One Page Rules lore before anyone else can cover One Page Rules lore. So that way people who are crazy enough to make their own armies don't have to listen to the competitors' lore. They can listen to the lore for the army they're making.
Mhm. Yeah, I love that. And I think that you really are a sort of a trailblazer in, like you said, you really stepped up. I think not just creating, I think there are some people who do it, but you've consistently done it. And like the quality of your videos, I'm just learning some of the video editing stuff. I mean, you've like the quality of your work is super good.
Thank you.
Um, so one of the things is that like I think is interesting, and I want to. Okay, so this is going to be a little long-winded, but I want to sort of preface this because maybe some people don't know about you. So one of the things that like you've got a great way of sort of showcasing one page rules lore in a very kind of a personal format, right? Like when I've read a lot of the lore for one page rules, it's very sort of big picture, overarching,
Mhm.
right? Which is sort of it's good for like the sandbox nature, but it's sort of like I don't get the same personal feel that like when I can read, like I said, maybe Games Workshop lore where you get that one-to-one personal connection. And one thing I think your lore sort of does is you sort of can really you do kind of dial in and pick and make it more personal. Like I think for me personally, one of my favorites was actually your Soul Snatchers. It was like 40 something minutes. And it was like super good where you talked about how this Soul Snatcher like slowly infiltrated this individual and then the society. And like I loved how you take OPR, which is like I said, very kind of big picture sandboxy, and you develop it. You really sort of develop it. So I guess I want to say all that to say, like, so do you this flavor? It's really your own, right? I mean, like, is this sanctioned by the OPR team? Is this stuff that you just sort of come up
Yeah.
with? Yeah.
So, no, it's not sanctioned. I actually early on offered the OPR team uh, editorial control. So it said, hey, you could read through the scripts and veto it. And they were very kind to say that they want to take a hands-off approach because they know that without there being a robust creator community around not only the hobby but the lore side, that the game's going to flounder. And so they don't want to get in the way of people. That being said, definitely not all none of my channel is sanctioned.
Mhm.
But um, it's I try really hard to base my content very strictly to the lore, but we can get into that if you want.
Yeah, because I think that that's an interesting discussion we'd like to have with you. Because are you, if there is no canon, like, and anyone can come, are you sort of really a like? So that's why it's so interesting about what you do. You're really sort of kind of establishing the canon yourself, right? It feels,
Yeah.
you know, is that true? Do you kind of see
Uh,
yourself like that? Yeah.
no, so I don't see myself as establishing the canon, although some people in my comments section act like I do, um, which it's fun. But the really the way I do it is I have multiple formats of videos, and so the rule of thumb is the shorter the video, the more aligned it is with the canon of one page rules. So I do shorts. That is 110% official content. Then I do these lore breakdowns, which are between 10 and 15 minutes, and that is as close as official as I can get it. But then I also do these expanded lore videos, which are where I go in and expand upon the lore that exists and then add in my own stories. So
Yeah.
that's as headcanon as you can get, but it's still what I try to do is preserve the what I believe to be the essence of the lore I'm talking about and build upon it.
What's really great is that you've got those three formats, and all three of them, to me anyway, really feel like they are the law. Obviously, the OPR law isn't that deep yet, but your deep dives into it, especially like your Machine Cult one, your Soul Snatchers Cult one, they really feel like, you know, if I didn't know how shallow the law still was, I would definitely feel like this is the official law because it's
It's
just
yeah.
done so well and it's so much in keeping with what we know is canon.
Well, appreciate that. Well, yeah, the comment from the one page rules team I saw on the Discord after I posted my Soul Snatcher cult video, which I is also my favorite video, was how did someone make a 50-minute video off of 5 paragraphs of lore?
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly.
I'm like,
And
a lot of work.
well, and it's funny we're talking about lore, and I almost want to put lore and canon in quotes because
Mhm.
the, it seems as it seems like the OPR team has sort of made it a point that there is no kind of canon. They use, I've heard the creator use this term of sandbox lore, where it's
Mhm.
really and so I guess I'm only saying that is like, isn't your stuff a lot more lore or canon? If in other words, I'd say this: if it's a sandbox and you're creating things in that sandbox, isn't what you're creating canon, right? I mean, anyway,
From
just
the standpoint of like I'm making a sandcastle,
yeah,
so
yeah,
that's one page more sand section of the sandbox where he built a sandcastle. Come and play with the sandcastle. It like that. Yes, that's lore there. But from a canonicity, there's it's. I don't even think one page rules has figured out what they're comfortable with in considering what is canon, what isn't canon. Is everything canon, or is there an actual canon event? And I think they're in a really tough spot with the majority of their audience really not caring because they are these refugees from Games Workshop. A lot of the times, those people invested a lot of time and energy into learning the lore of Warhammer 40K, and they just want a better rule set or a cheaper option while
mhm,
still keeping the lore they love.
yeah,
And so that there's this tightrope walk that one page rules has to do of, well, they know that their game system won't thrive without a story that is compelling,
mhm,
but they also don't want to alienate their audience um, by putting something that is like this is our official lore. And we can see that with other game companies like Kings of War, for example, Mantic. Um, that pretty successful, but it's the adoption of the game went about as far as the adoption of their lore.
Yeah.
Yeah, in case you don't know, me and Dan we're both heavy Kings of War players, and
Yeah.
I've basically given up on it now. It's so because one of the things they did is when uh Games Workshop killed Warhammer Fantasy, Kings of War, made adaptations and armies for the things that they didn't already have. And then one of the things that's kind of happened now is they're really stopping supporting that, and they're really pushing their own stuff and their own IPs now, to the exclusion of if you came in as one of those refugees, and it's a very frustrating experience.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's an interesting that you brought up because I think it's a good comparison because I think, and this is sort of what I'm really glad to have you on because we can talk about, like I said, IPs and sort of how one page rules handles it, which I feel they tend to have, at least when I pick up, I don't seem to imagine they take their lore very seriously. In other words, they say, okay, here's a sandbox, sort of develop your own stuff. And they give people like yourself the freedom to do that. Like if you were doing this on GW stuff, like you'd be getting, you got any sort of monetization. I mean, GW would be coming after you, right? They'd be wanting to,
Yeah.
okay, and I think that one things that one page rules right now has avoided is what happened with Kings of War, which is that Kings of War got successful because it's the game mechanics. And then the creator was like, oh, look at me. I want to create my own stuff. And I want to put dwarves flying birds, which as a dwarf player doesn't make any, like, why would dwarves ever fly on birds? Like it doesn't, it's like,
Yeah.
and so it's like
Those are
all of
big
a sudden,
birds.
yeah, he thought that like people were there for his lore and no one cared about his lore. And yeah, so maybe kind of speak to like, do you do you agree with that sentiment that One Page Rules is taking regarding their lore and yeah, sort of kind of dig into that.
Yeah. So I've always been impressed with one page rules when it comes to their lore, actually, because they're walking that tightrope. But one of the things that I really enjoyed with their old lore, because as of like a month ago, they released new lore, which didn't
Mm.
supersede the old one. It just there's more of it. One of the things I really loved about it was one of the best scavenger hunts when it came to content that I've been on in my entire life because it took me uh reading 6 or 7 factions before I realized that the Sirius sector wasn't even in the Milky Way galaxy.
Mm.
And that was a really important thing of like, oh, you actually have to read the Custodian Brothers and then the Battle Brothers, and then you have to read the Alien Hives and the Dow Union and be able to piece everything together to figure out what's even going on. And that was incredibly well done. So whoever wrote the original lore, good job to you. I'm impressed. The because there weren't contradictions in the lore, but they still hid these little treasures throughout everything, and that was great. But once you assembled everything, there isn't a whole lot of teeth to the content because they're
Yeah,
trying to make it this playground.
yeah.
Um,
That's
the
actually
way I,
some.
sorry,
Sorry.
go ahead.
No, I interrupted you. Go on.
No, go ahead.
I was just gonna say one thing I actually really appreciate about OPI is how much they do lean into that community aspect of the sandbox of the lore. Like they have their writing jams where
Hmm.
they're actively inviting kind of community participation in like here's a topic, now go ahead and write some lore for it and people get to vote on it and it gets kind of widely disseminated. And nothing's quote unquote official, but I think it's a
Yeah,
really cool way that they promote this idea of this is in fact, sandbox lore, make it your own. You can do whatever you want. You can take it in whatever direction you want it to go in.
yeah. Instead of your own forge the narrative, it's build your sandcastle.
Yeah,
Uh,
I love that analogy. Build your sandcastle.
yeah,
And
because
and that
that's the other thing. It's going to be unstable because it's not official.
Yep.
Well, too, and that's something that I, because I read the lore book that they produced, and I think it was jarring. Like I said, and I think that I felt similar to what the refugees of Games Workshop, which is that, oh, I was expecting sort of like, oh, Games Workshop level of like commitment. I don't know.
Hmm.
You're right. And I can, another way I'd say it this way. I can understand why some people maybe don't like that. They want something like, they almost want it to be geo. They want something that's stark. They want something that's very detailed. And I think that those people are really just wanting to almost replicate Games Workshop lore. And there's no reason to do that because Games
It
Workshop
exists.
lore is Games Workshop lore, right?
Yeah.
Do you do you like and isn't it sort of that's the thing that they're trying to avoid, right? They don't want to just try to do that, right? That's already been done.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm I'm not really sure where they're planning on going with it. I I think when it comes to the actual depth and the details, the best example of one page rules approach versus uh 40K really is on the army list because there isn't a lore blurb or a fluff blurb for every single unit. There isn't any for any of the units. And that's a, kind of an interesting idea to me is the lore is at such a higher level that we don't even know what the close combat weapon for any given faction looks like, acts like, or we don't know what this specific thing, like the great beast from the jackals. There's no description of that, and I think that boils it down to the core of what one page rules is, hey, if you want to play this game with a bunch of odds and ends from your house, cool. Like if someone brings a soda can and says that's a jackal great beast, and I'm like, yeah, that's a jackal great beast, we can play. And that's the
Hmm.
same thing with the rules. I mean, not the rules, the lore is it's trying to give us a general vibe of what's going on, to give us very specific rules around the types of stories, the motifs of each faction, without breaking it into, hey, you have to paint your blessed sisters in this color scheme, or they're not
Yeah.
blessed sisters.
How did you feel? So the lore book has been on a lot of people's minds, and this was a big thing they did, is they, originally before this, it was all about the Sirius sector, but the World Book actually exposed the fact that there's apparently the Sirius sector is such a small part of the galaxy that there's this inner rim, there's this outer rim, there's this, I forget, like the frontier or something.
Yes. The
How do
inner
you,
sphere, outer sphere,
yeah,
frontier.
how did you, so one thing, would you want to take the direction of exploring those? Or do you want to stay in this? Because it feels like there is a lot more to explore outside the Sirius sector. And in other words, where do you see yourself exploring this universe? In the Sirius sector, or are you going to start going out there into the other parts of the galaxy?
Um, I uh I have some heated opinions when it comes to that lore book actually.
Hmm.
Uh and specifically around the galaxy as a whole. Um One is we've got like 8 paragraphs of lore relating to any given faction.
Yeah.
So why do I need to know about the political inner workings of the inner sphere in the greater galaxy? So that's I would like to have the alien hives flushed out more extensively, or at least their lore be a little bit more consistent than learn that the inner sphere has been at peace for so long no one has any war. Like
Yeah.
that's it that part of the book really helped me understand what it's like to live in the galaxy, which is important because you need to know who's outside of the Sirius sector, what's the life is, so you can compare and contrast. It's a really common thing that you find in tabletop RPGs like they'll have their setting books, and the setting book will have a section that talks about, the world as a whole, or if it's the setting takes place in a town, you'll learn about what the kingdom's like. But that section tends to be 1, 2 pages, whereas and I actually went through paragraph by paragraph in the lore book, the world book, I should say, and it comes out to be 32% of the book deals with stuff that has no relation to the Sirius sector.
Yeah.
And that I'm like, okay, the very first page where it describes the setting, it describes the Sirius sector at war with all of these factions, and then we spend a third of the book talking about something completely different.
Yeah,
So
it's really interesting, and I don't. It's sort of I don't mind it. It's something that I can see a lot of people. I wonder if they're doing this to actually make room for like the custom army creator where you can fight outside. It makes the Sirius
ooh,
sector
that's
seem
cool.
small and insignificant. And
Yes.
is that a good thing or bad thing? I don't know.
I would argue that in a game that's based on a particular section, making that section seem insignificant isn't necessarily a good thing.
Yeah.
That's fair.
Um, like I said,
One of
it's an interesting take. Yeah.
one of the things about the Sirius sector that I was really excited for in particular was one, it's a sector of a galaxy. And so the stories that you can tell there are on a smaller scale and are far more personal. And so you get these interactions between these factions. There's more opportunity for them to interact with everyone because there's not enough room. It's kind of like the what I was hoping for was uh, a bunch of people crammed in a phone box having a knife fight. But when you look at the map that they provide around the Sirius sector, everyone has a comfy buffer around them. There seems to be plenty of room. And that was an interesting choice. And like there's a passage where it describes the Saurian star hosts coming back to the Sirius sector to reclaim their planets. And it talked because at that time the Elven Empire was still in place. Says the Saurian star hosts talked to the local governments, and they came to an agreement where they would essentially immigrate into the Sirius sector.
Mhm.
And I was thinking when I was reading that, I'm like, I don't know very many civilizations based on radical religious beliefs about the doomsday
Hmm.
that follow proper procedures of when they want to reclaim what they believe to be rightfully theirs.
Yeah.
It's like
And
you,
I,
so
I
stuff like that,
and
it
you
seemed
have
a
an
little too
like you have an
feasible.
yeah, like you have an opportunity here to introduce like conflict and just kind of.
Yes.
that's what it is. I think that when I read the lore book, it's very, I would say the word tepid about introducing what I think it does do. It gives a lot of room for conflict. They don't cause any conflict. But I would say this, one of the advantages of doing that is that it's not like 40K, where in 40K lore, everything is so broken and problematic right now that the moment you add any additional problems to it, it seems like the universe is going to fall apart.
Yeah.
Where in the one page rules lore, there is a lot of room for basically bad things to happen, right? So, yeah.
Yeah. It really is um, a Cold War that it's a that is a tinderbox ready
That's exactly.
to to light up in conflict. And I understand why they're doing that because one of their core tenets is any faction should be able to ally with any faction, and any faction should be able to fight any other faction. So they don't want to set up that the Dow Union and the Orcs are diametrically opposed and they could never fight with and ally with each other. They don't want to do that. So they're trying to leave room for both internal conflict and external conflict, and also internal collaboration and external collaboration.
Yeah, but that's not a
Um,
Yeah.
that's a trap, right? I mean,
yes.
that's you can understand what they're trying to do that, but when you actually play that out, it doesn't work. You get into the situation where you're people reading this are going to see, well, why are we even fighting at all then, right? I mean, it's like if we have room, we have, if there's not, what 40K does really well, I think actually is establish the fact that there is this kind of all out war between all the factions. And yeah, sometimes people will kind of team up temporarily, but but it's and I think that's okay. I don't think you need to write your alliances kind of stuff, and or I don't think you need to like leave room for friendship in the lore. I think it's okay for
Yeah.
players will figure that out themselves, right?
Uh, yeah, to your point there, I don't know what problem they're trying to solve because I've never found anyone who is like, okay, the Eldari and the Space Marines can't have a combined force. I don't know the appropriate terms for that in 40K, but like usually what happens is they find like, oh, this is an impossible pairing. I'm going to come up with my own personal headcanon for why my army works.
Yeah, exactly. Like
Yeah.
that's I think players are going to be much more inclined to do that, and it's I don't think you don't need the established, and that makes it interesting too, right? Because then you have to be creative about, okay, well, why is it that these two forces who are normally diametrically opposed are working together? Maybe they were stranded on a planet together, and they had to team up to fight some larger force, and over time
Yeah.
they kind of came to an accord. I mean you give people the opportunity to do that. You don't actually have to.
Yeah,
It's more
I
interesting that way.
I've never come across a group of war gamers who are like, right, now we need a good reason why we're fighting each other. Like
Well,
the premise of the game is it's a war game. There shouldn't be that much space. There shouldn't be that much peace and understanding. We're supposed
Hmm.
to kind of clobber each other.
yeah, but
That's
I think
like I said, why I don't know what problem they're trying to solve
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
this
well,
approach because
I
I've
think
never
that
encountered it.
I mean, I think what you said something that actually was on mine because I read this book and me and Boz, we're going to do some other talks about it. You said TTRPG, a tabletop RPG. And when you said that, that's exactly what I thought about when I read the Lore book.
Yeah.
Mm.
This isn't a canon. This is basically a tabletop, uh, basically GM's guide.
Yeah,
Like
it's
it's
like a source book for GMs, isn't it?
the source book. Like, and one thing that just stuck to me, which was they had one particular paragraph where they're like talking about currency, and then like, oh, it's so difficult for each of these factions to manage their own currencies for adventurers. So in other words, each of these factions have such a difficult time managing a currency. But they goes, but for adventurers, they just use galaxy credits. And I'm like,
Yeah.
wait, galaxy credits? Like, how does that
Adventurers?
adventurers and like mercenaries? That's what this is for. The book is really for maybe skirmish games. It mentions a lot of mercenaries, mentions adventurers. It feels a lot more like a tabletop role play. What do you call it? A GM's guide almost.
Yeah, and
So
Yeah.
that's a game design trap for war game developers, because while there is some crossover in interest between war gamers and tabletop roleplay players, I think all of us, I mean, at least I know Dan and Boz all do kind of both, right?
mhm.
But not everybody does. And there are people who only do one or the other. There's some crossover, but in what it's kind of like what I'm looking for in my wargaming is not the same thing as I'm looking for in my tabletop RPGs.
Yeah.
And it's okay that that's the case. Like you don't, you know,
Yeah, I'm all about the narrative. I love one of the reasons I love your channel so much is because it is so much focused on the lore. But at the end of the day, I'm not playing a TTRPG. I am playing a war game. I want a narrative war game, but the war game part is what I'm after for this particular gaming experience.
Mhm. Well, I would say this, and that is what's really great about One Page More, because for me, and I think I speak for a lot of people in the community, you are canon. What you say goes. So I consider
That's too
you to
much
be.
power. Uh, yeah. One last thing. My first impression when I opened up the world book was, oh, this is formatted and it looks almost like uh the tabletop RPG books from the early 2000s that I read. So like the D20 systems, Pathfinder First Edition. Like this is comfort territory for me. I know that this isn't what I was expecting from a war game. So
Mhm.
from a setting book for RPG, I think it was fantastic.
Yeah, ditto.
But
But but that's not what we thought we were getting.
Yes,
yep.
that's and that's the rub.
Yes, I think that it's an incredibly well written book that the the parts that actually deal with the serious sector, which is about 40% of the book, is worth the price tag for that world book.
Maybe we can have you on again because it's funny. I think that we would love to have you on to have an in-depth discussion about the lore, but because I think that I have written several pages of notes on the lore. So, but let's get on. So I know we got to close it out a little bit, but how about this? So lore is your thing. So what is your favorite faction in sci-fi and fantasy? We've heard about the Zerg, but
Yeah.
is that your, so maybe a sci-fi. So what is your really favorite sci-fi and fantasy lore? Got to pick one for both.
Okay, so factions and one-page rules. My favorite, I would love to say that my favorite was Alien Hives. I love the mechanics, but lore-wise, I actually um, love the wormhole demons.
Mm,
Their
that
lore is
was
my
good.
favorite out of the
Yep.
entire thing. And then the from fantasy, um, the Shadow Stalkers. I haven't really gotten that much into fantasy because I'm spending so much time in the grimdark future setting. But the Shadow Stalkers, you know, things leaking from a different dimension into ours and wreaking havoc, it's pretty darn cool.
Something
Very
to
cool.
it's the copy of a Kings of War arm in case you didn't know that. Hopefully
Yes.
they do it better than the Kings of War does.
Well, the wormhole, and you did an episode on wormhole demons, I believe, right?
Yes.
And it's
So
really good. Yeah. Okay. Yeah,
the
it's
reason
very
why I
good.
love the wormhole demons is so I love physics. And when I'm reading through the description, I'm like, oh, they're not describing like the way that the different demon factions are avoiding the imminent death
Yep.
is the same way that you avoid, or is it the same way that you actually transfer entropy from one system to another? And so, like, a good example of this is the wormhole demons of plague. If you read through the description, they're describing how a refrigerator works, where you're taking the higher entropy or the temperature from inside the refrigerator, and then through a series of tubes and different heat exchanges, you're exhausting that out. And so the demon of plague, in my mind, like the actual god of plague, would be immaculately clean because it's taken all of its decay and put it on its followers.
Hmm. It's interesting.
That is interesting, actually.
New lore right here created on any war game, anytime podcast. I love it. Lore has been created. I like that.
You heard it here first, folks.
That's right.
Official one-page rules lore.
So are we saying
Demons of
that
plague are
plague?
refrigerators.
Yeah. So we're saying that the plague god themselves is in fact a refrigerator
Yes.
because I
Yes.
have that model.
That's great.
Custom army. All right, well, that's awesome. That's awesome. So tell us, and this is we love to ask this to our guests. If time, so I know we all work, and we all have lives, but if time and money were not a factor, what would your dream war game experience be? So you're talking, you're Jeff Bezos, you don't have to work anymore. 100% of your time is wargaming. What would your dream wargaming experience be?
Yeah, that is a big question. I think it would be having a galactic map or a sector map, and then having a set of players controlling different factions, and then we have a set of rules that allows us to move around, and then we can go down one level and we play FTL. And then we're like, oh, we need to invade this planet. We drop down to Grim Dark Future. And if we need to even go further, we can go down to Firefight, and just having the multi-layer across everything, and then spend like a year with this group. And all we do is we play out this massive campaign, and we keep track of everything. So at the end of it, we end up with this very hyper detailed map of who took over what sector, and we have stories for everything, and we track to see what powerful characters emerge from that. That would be my number one dream gaming experience.
That is not the first time we've heard a similar answer, and I gotta tell you, it's kind of mine too.
Yeah, I think it's everyone's.
Like, there's all these systems, and they do scale up and down, and yeah, if time and money weren't a factor, that'd be my jam as well.
Although I think I did just describe the gameplay of EVE Online.
Yeah. Oh boy, and Eve is it takes a special kind of person to play Eve.
Yeah.
I've heard stories about Eve. It's
You have to have a kind of a working knowledge of astrophysics to.
well, you actually like how do people even play that? Like I don't know. I
How
guess
does anyone read through all of the Horus Heresy books? I put those about the same.
Well, that's great. So, before we let you go, tell us some of the cool things you got planned for the channel.
Yeah.
What can we look forward to?
So I've been working on a couple of different video formats. So my video formats, like we described, are, various versions of lore with mixtures of my own headcanon in it. What I'm trying to do is move into two video formats. One is how to write your own lore for your army that still fits within one-page rules.
Mm.
And that's taking it from the standpoint of, like, you have an army, let's now walk you through all of the questions and the steps to really figure out what your army is, why it's important, what makes it fun to even learn to talk about, and then how to match that to your intended audience and what type of content you want to write for it. And then so that way people can produce it. And I'm also working to make a worksheet for that. And so I'm hoping to make that available so people could, like, look at their army, work through the worksheet, and at the end of it, they would have all of the notes they need to write their own stories.
Do you have a timeline on that? Because that sounds really cool, and I
Great.
want it.
Yeah. I'm hoping I can do it in the next month or so. I did
Wonderful.
hurt my foot on Sunday, and so that might mean I have more time to work on this stuff than I was expecting. But yeah, so that's my first one. And the where that idea came from is I wanted to make a video on how to fix the alien hives, their lore. And
Yeah.
so started thinking about that and realized, like, okay, well, you need to understand, like, how to write lore. And that fractured off into, well, how do you write lore for your own army? And so the other video I want to write is, this is how I would fix the alien hives.
Yeah.
Because again, mechanically my favorite faction, aesthetically my favorite faction, they're actually my least favorite faction when it comes to lore.
Oh, I'm just going to so avoid I feel like you're tossing out bait to me, and I so want to talk about it. We would love to have you back on just to talk about
Right.
lore, because I think that we've read the book, and I think all of us have some great opinions. Mr. One Page More, it is, again, it's so great. And for me, I think having someone like yourself who can actually, I consider it, develop real lore for this game, I think is great. Thank you again for coming on. We appreciate it.
Appreciate you having me.
Boz, any last words?
Just to echo Dan, it's so great having you on, and keep on putting out the amazing content. I especially love the real deep dives you do. Keep on doing, Soul Snatcher and Machine Cult-esque levels of depth, because you do it really well.
Thank you.
The presentation's great, the story's great, and I just lap it up. So more, please.
Well, there's always one page more.
Oh yeah, I like that.
Thank you again. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Any war game, anytime. Going where the game is good.